All right, cool. Well, we'll get started here in just a second. We still have 3 minutes. So while we're going through everything here, just for those that aren't familiar, basically this Slack channel, I'm going to get out of here in a minute just to save on some memory because Slack is you know, a bit of a memory killer. But basically, the workshop's here. This channel's here for you guys to kind of chat during, to ask you know, things of each other, to network. Same with random if you want to go post all your GIFs and so forth and memes. But questions, I'd like to try to reserve for questions at the end. You're welcome to post in here during, but I won't look at them until kind of the end of the workshop. So feel free to go ahead and post them here as you have them. Maybe somebody else can answer them if they want, but I'll try to go in and definitely address all of those towards the end of the I guess, workshop. So for the next 50 minutes, it's going to be all live coding, or roughly 50 minutes. We'll see how far we get. But this is the first of I guess probably about 3 workshops where we're going to be focusing on PHPUnit, focusing on Mockery to kind of test code in different capacities. So today is kind of the very beginning, very basic. We're just going to familiarize ourselves with PHPUnit. So with that, let's go ahead and jump in. So I'm going to kill Slack. I'm going to assume everything's good with the video and the sound. So thanks for the feedback, you guys. All right. So I'm also going to maximize this guy a little bit more. Okay, so basically there is a Start Testing PHP project I have out on GitHub. We can go check that out for those that want to download it. Let's go to github.com and then Jason McCreary. I'll post, or well, I should have posted that in Slack. Maybe somebody else can help me do that. But basically, here's a sample project. Really all it is just kind of a rough project structure, and then inside of the composer.json we can see over here back in PHP Storm. Basically it's just making development requirements of the PHPUnit package. That's going to be the one we focus on today. There's also Codeception and Mockery in here for the later ones. The one that matters today is PHPUnit. So again, you're welcome to clone or download this to kind of follow along as we go through. So that's basically what I've done. That's what this project is that you're seeing. There's nothing in like my source or test project or test folder, I mean. It's all just really basic. And all I've done on the command line is basically run composer install just to save time and bandwidth while I'm live streaming. So that's basically where I am. I'm on the master branch. Nothing else is in here, and we're just going to get started from here. So once you have Composer install, you get everything in your vendor bin folder. You can install PHPUnit globally. I normally don't do that just because I like to keep a project and all of its dependencies within that project. That way if other devs are checking it out or I'm checking it out on another machine, it's all good. I don't have to worry about some local setup. Some people, you know, they like to have everything on their local machines, totally fine. But right now it's in here, it's going to make it easy to run. So when I do this and run, I just get the help message because I haven't configured PHP to do anything, PHPUnit to do anything in this project. I didn't tell it by hand kind of anything to look at. So I'm just going to get kind of the help message. Just to back up a second, those that aren't familiar at all with PHPUnit, it's kind of the de facto unit testing framework in PHP. And it's based on the XUnit style of testing. So this style of testing can actually be found in a lot of other languages. For example, there's JUnit in Java. There's QUnit. I think jQuery uses this as a JS testing library. But they're going to have really familiar patterns and really familiar like assertions. So that's kind of why I think this has gained popularity in PHP, and it's also honestly been around the longest. So, but jumping back in, if we go vendor bin PHPUnit, and I say something like tests, I want to run the test in the test directory. It's going to attempt to go in here, but I don't have any tests in here, so we're going to see this no tests executed, right? So let's jump back to PHP Storm and actually start making kind of our first test. So there's a couple conventions that we need. I'm going to get rid of those because this is actually from one of the other branches. So you probably won't see that in yours. Let me just clear it out for convenience there. Okay, so inside test, basically what I want to do is make a new test. And I'm just gonna, I can use in PHP Storm like this PHPUnit test if I wanted to, but I don't want to use a template just for today, so we can really just start truly from scratch and you can see it from the beginning. So the file name here is, I'm just going to say something like example test. It's convention to normally name these with the suffix of test. So whatever your thing is that you're going to test, that would be first, in this case example, and then suffix it with test. This is a common convention. If you do this, PHPUnit's automatically going to pick up your test cases without extra configuration. You can configure it to look for anything inside of a certain folder, that's fine, but this test part is a kind of a nice convention to follow. So I've got that in my test directory, and I'm basically just going to say class example test. We're going to stick with this PSR4 here, and then I need to extend test case, which is going to be a PHPUnit framework test case. So that's what I should have, and this should run. Now, if you're running an older version of PHPUnit, you may not have this PSR4 fanciness happening, in which case you may need to do this underscore approach, which I think there's an extra test case on there. Yeah, here we go, sorry. That's the one you're gonna want. So again, if you're on an earlier version and you're not getting auto-completion, or you're getting class not found for some reason, it's probably because you're running PHPUnit prior to version 6, which is their latest version, and they were still using this PSR0 underscore convention instead of using folder paths. I am running PHP Unit 6, so I'm going to go back to this. And if you're not sure, you can actually find that out by running composer show PHPUnit, and I think this will tell you, whoops, I think I got to pull in the full thing, but let's just do this. If you run PHP show, you can actually look through what version is installed for, composer show. You can actually see what version of yours are actually installed. So in this case, PHPUnit 6.4. So just a small difference there. All right, so if I run vendor bin PHPUnit again, whoops, forgot to point it at my test folder. So same thing, it actually picked up example tests, but now it's getting a warning, hey, no tests are found. Okay, no problem. Let me just clear the screen and put that up top here so it's a little easier. So again, we get a W here for warning, and it says no tests. Okay, cool. So let's make our first test. Again, typical convention is to make these public methods, and you prefix them with test. So let's just say here test equals assertion. So anything after test is totally up to you what you want to do. Some people like underscore convention. Some people like the camel case. That's entirely up to you. I find myself kind of sticking with camel case just for the whole PSR2 bit, but you're welcome to do whatever. What matters is that this test part is in front of your function name. That's a convention. Again, PHPUnit's going to automatically pick up any public function inside of here that's prefixed with test and assume that that's a test case you want to run. You can get around that with an annotation as well. So I could say something here like @test. It'll actually pick it up that way, and then I wouldn't have to do this. That's a little more code to write. I'm not a big annotation person. It feels like Java to me. So I normally just leave the test prefix. That's the most common way to do it. Again, it's a little less typing in my book. So let's run this. And we'll see here, okay, we get this case an R, which is a risky test. It found that test case now, but it didn't perform any assertions. So this is some terminology here that we're dealing with. So each test here is what PHPUnit's going to call a test case, right? So we can think of it as each function is a test case, all right? And then inside of there, we would want to make assertions. So in this case, I've called it test equal assert. So let's talk a little bit about an equals assertion. So inside of a test case, PHPUnit's going to give me access to all sorts of assertions. And there are like 100 of these. So we're going to go over a few of them today. But I'm going to go over the kind of the most common ones, and then at the end I'll show you where you can kind of read about more. So for example, let's start with equals. And let's just say something like 1 equals 1. Real simple. So PHP Storm's kind of helped me out here and giving me kind of the parameter name. So the first parameter is expected. That's what I expect my assertion to kind of act on or test against. And then the actual is the second parameter. So again, these are some more conventions inside of the testing world, some more terms. What is the expected result and what was the actual result? So you'll kind of hear that a lot. And again, so it's expected, actual, so first, second. So in this case, we're just going to go ahead and make this thing pass. So I'm just going to say assert equals 1 is 1. So let's go back and run this again. And yay, everything is passing. We can see that by the dot here. And we also see at the bottom, assert, 1 test, 1 assertion, everything's okay. I can actually add a flag here for colors, so -- colors, just to make things a little more fun and a little more kind of visually, a visual cue that I've passed or failed. So a lot of times, again, in testing, you'll hear people say, are the tests green? This is what they're talking about. They're talking about the fact that they pass. Green meaning pass, red meaning fail. So to that point, let's make something fail. So let's push the boundaries here and learn a little bit more about assert equals. So simply, we could just say 0, expect 0 to be 1. We would expect that to fail. That was going to lead to a failing assertion. So we get the red F here. We get red as far as the colors output. We see failures. Again, 1 test was run, 1 test case was run, and it contained 2 assertions. So pretty straightforward stuff, but just kind of hammering it through so you can get used to these terms and so forth, and get used to kind of the console and the output of PHPUnit. It's definitely important to kind of make sure that things are testing the way you expect. So in this case, failed asserting that 1 matches expected 0. We also get line numbers. So line number 8. Line number 8 looks good to me. And then we see, of course, the red failure down here at the bottom. So let's push this a little bit farther. Let's go back to making it pass. But what I want to demonstrate is a subtle difference in equals. Or at least when you're starting out. Everyone kind of uses assert equals. So let me demonstrate where the wheels kind of fall off assert equals, or at least the boundary of it. So we see, again, everything's okay here, passing. 1 test, 2 assertions. So string 1 is equal to integer 1. So equals is not strict with its typing, right? It's not a strict equality check, meaning what it's doing underneath the covers is really more like this, right? And because of that, you may end up in scenarios where if you have something return null or return false, or for example, if we were messing with something like the string pause function, that's one of those binary functions in PHP that can return 0, but it can also return false, and we want to make sure we're kind of being Boolean safe with it. This is where assert equals could actually give you a false sense of security that is passing. So let's introduce something else. I'm going to make another test case. And again, we want to prefix that with test. So let's test same assert. And this is the difference. I want to assert same, and this is going to give me that strict equality. So I'm going to expect that 1 is equal to 1. All right, we're going to run that again. We're still green. We see that we have 2 tests now and 3 assertions. That makes sense. And let's do something like this. Assert not same. 1, the string 1, is not equal to the integer 1. Let's run that. And we get an exception undefined method. Whoops, I didn't finish that out. My bad. Not same. All right. So yeah, again, make sure you're looking at your errors here. Call to undefined method. That was my bad, little fat finger there. And we're green. So those are the differences between assert equals and assert same. So you definitely want to make sure that if you care about strict equality, or you have functions that maybe are returning things like null, but they could also return values like 0 or false, or things of that nature, mixed return types, you may want your tests to be more strict. So pay attention to those. A lot of times in the beginning, people just use assert equals throughout. To that point, let's do some other ones. So function test true assert. All right, and let's just do assert true. And we would expect to have some kind of true condition here, right? So this isn't expected actual, it's just a condition that gets put in here, and the result of that is automatically going to be compared against true. So we'll see that that passes. And the point I want to make here is that there's all sorts of helper ones, and we'll take a look at these here in a second on the web, but there's assert false. There's also an assert count. There's very particular things, and I like trying to be as specific as possible when I'm writing PHP unit tests. You'll learn more of them over time, but there's all sorts of things inside of here. Assert count, we can assert is empty, all sorts of things of that nature, where like an array, for example, has a very particular count. So the expected count here is 2, and my haystack, for example, would be a 2-element array. So let's just make sure all those pass real quick. And they do. So I won't keep going down through all of these. Let's actually get in and start testing some real code. But just to summarize some pieces here, definitely want to make sure, obviously, to make a PHP unit test, you need to extend the test case. Make sure that's appropriate for your version of PHP unit. So PHP unit 6, version 6 and above supports PSR 4. Before that, they were PSR 0. So you'll need to throw the underscores in here. And then as far as each one of your test cases, you want to make sure that those are prefixed with test. Otherwise, they won't pick up and be run. So for example, another method, and let's just put this here. So notice that it's 3 tests. It doesn't pick up, it doesn't say 4 tests, right? It didn't pick up that other one because we don't have it prefixed or annotated with test. So again, you can do other helper methods inside here. You can have private methods, protected methods, all sorts of things. But unless it's a public method that's prefixed with test, PHP unit's not going to pick that up and run any kind of tests inside of those or make any of those assertions. One last thing as far as the assertions. Some people are really strict about making sure that one test case and one assertion. I don't necessarily believe in that as much, and to me it's really more about behavior. What I want my tests to be focusing on is a piece of behavior. Now that behavior might end up testing one very specific thing, but that behavior might also have multiple things in which it can test, right? That seems a little abstract right now. It's going to become more clear once we actually start testing kind of a real class instead of these example tests. But the point here is that I don't feel the need to follow that convention strictly. If it works out that way, great, where I have, one test and then one assertion. So ideally, in this case, some people would say I should have 7 tests that are 7 assertions. Obviously, I don't have that, and obviously, I don't follow that. So, okay, I am going to get rid of this example test just to kind of keep things clean. And what I want to do is I'm going to download this set class that I have in my example. So if we go to collection, the collection branch, you can actually jump in source and get this collection class. We're not necessarily gonna test drive this thing out today, just in the interest of time. I'll do that in one of the later workshops. But for today, I'm just gonna copy that raw source and make a collection class here. And whoops, didn't need that open PHP. And so again, I just copied that from the web here, from the, make sure you jump over to the collection branch here, and you should be able to, underneath source, grab the collection. So this is going to give me a class to test. That way we don't have to drive it out or anything, just in the interest of time, because as a beginner lesson, I want to make sure we're focusing a little bit more on using PHPUnit and kind of getting it set up and getting familiar with running it. So all this is a collection. You can think of it as a wrapper of an array. We have methods like isEmpty, size, add, remove, and contains. We can even see underneath the covers we're actually just using an array. But it kind of turns this into a object that's going to be a little easier to work with in a code base, right? So this is becoming a common pattern inside of PHP. For example, Laravel has this built in as kind of a first class data type that you can use inside of Laravel. The framework uses it heavily. So really just a very simple kind of start naive approach of that. But what we want to do is we want to test this class. Let's say we've written it and we want to write some tests for it now. So I'm going to go back to my tests. I'm going to make a new PHP file, and I'm going to call this collection test. Again, the convention is to use whatever class I want to test as the first part, and then I want to suffix that with test so PHPUnit picks that up for me automatically. I'm going to do a class here, and again, that's just going to match my name, and I'm going to extend the test case. Let's make sure we pick the right one this time. I'm not sure why they're throwing in that extra test on the end. That's incorrect, but that's all right. PHP Storm will be okay. Cool. So let's go back and run our tests. Great. So we get that warning that we got before because we haven't made any tests. All right. So hopefully everybody's that far along. Again, just made a collection test that's going to start testing this collection object. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually split the screen with these guys. I like doing this when I'm, doing some TDD or kind of working out testing a particular class. So, whoops, I closed the wrong one. All right, so I'm going to have my test on the left and my implementation on the right here. So it's just kind of nice and easy to work through. So what I want to do is I'm just going to work my way down this file. So I'm going to start with this isEmptyPublic function. Or public method, sorry, and I'm just going to go ahead and start testing that. So let's do public function test is empty. Make life easy, again, that prefix of test, and then just the method name that I'm going to test. So in this case, the easiest thing to do here is we want to put kind of our testing hat on, enable that testing brain, and start thinking, okay, what are kind of the different logical paths of testing is empty? I personally, after practicing TDD for a couple years, I find it harder to kind of test legacy code, code without tests, for example, because my mindset's not in all these different user flows, and sometimes it can be harder to figure out, well, how many user, how many paths does this have? How many logical paths, right? Fortunately, these are pretty easy today, but as we continue these workshops, we'll kind of see that become harder. I think it can take, a pretty good amount of awareness and attention to kind of seek all those out after the fact, right? It's one of those things, you don't know what you don't know, right? So, but is empty, again, pretty straightforward in this case. Let's test that when we have an empty collection, it obviously would return true, we would think. And when we don't have an empty collection, it's going to return false. So let's set that up. So I'm just going to say something like one collection, or let's say empty collection is equal to new collection. And I don't have anything in it, so let's go ahead and make that assert, right? And we could do assert equals, and we could do assert same. For example, we could say assert false or true in this case when we call collection empty collection is empty, right? So we could do this, just real strict that we want it to be assert true. But what I want to do is say assert true. Again, if there's one that's there, that's the one I want to use. It's going to be more explicit, it's going to be less to type, and it also gives you a nicer error message when that happens to fail. So let's run this. Okay, we have a couple problems. It doesn't know what collection class is. That's because A, we haven't included it, namespaced it, done anything to include this collection class. For today, what I'm going to do is add another parameter to this that's called bootstrap. And what this allows you to do is bootstrap a file that should be run before. So I'm going to bootstrap source collection.php. And everything passes now. Again, this path is relative to the current location, not necessarily the location of PHPUnit or where your tests are. I could do a require once up here if I wanted to. That's just a little bit ugly. It feels a little old school to me from a PHP perspective. I feel like I'm going back to like PHP 4 when I do that. So I want to use Bootstrap for now, and then if we have time at the end, I'll show you how to use PHPUnit's configuration. But for now, since we're just dealing with one file that we need to load in order to run our tests, we can leverage this Bootstrap thing to load it up for us automatically. So just think of that like automatically running the require once for us. And we see everything's passing here, right? Just to prove that things are all working the way we want, let's just do something like assert false here on the empty collection. And of course, we get a failure, right? Failed asserting that true is false. Line 10. Line 10. Okay, great. So we don't want to test an empty collection returns false when we call is empty. So let's make like a one collection. And I'm just going to say something like new collection. And we'll say one collection dot add, not ass. So we'll do add, and I'll just add one. Nothing fancy there. So I have a collection with one thing in it. Let's run that. We would expect it to be false, and it is. Great. So you're probably starting to notice like the bit here where we're doing like assert and then call and then verify, right? Or more simply, the assert and then the expectation. So, or like setup, if you will. So at a real high level, we're really just setting things up. Here it is, setup, and then we make some kind of expectation, or in more PHPUnit terms, I think I overwrote that on accident, assertion or assertions, right? So it's really kind of a very simple pattern that you'll follow in your test. Do whatever setup you need to do, and then actually, invoke or run that thing. In this case, call is empty, and then make an assertion on it. We could easily var that off if we wanted to, if it's more clear to you, or there's more complex calculations going on. We can do that, no problem, and then make the assertion there. So, but that's a real common pattern here. So I'm going to say that we're okay with is empty for now. We've really just tested very straightforwardness. So we're going to say checkbox on that. Let's move on down to assert size. Let's just keep going through here. Let's check time. Oh, good. We got a good 25 minutes. I think we'll be able to get through this whole class. So let's move a little quicker here. Size. And let's borrow the empty collection again. I'm just going to copy and paste up here. So I want to take empty collection. And here we can do an assertion on it. So this assert, and again, I want to try to use same. I want to be as strict as possible in my test. That's the whole point of making the test. Even though PHP as a language might be dynamic, might be weakly typed, from a testing perspective, it matters to me if something if size in this case returns truly an integer 0, right? That would be my expectation. That's what I want to assert on. If I did assert equals here, someone could come back later and throw in false, and this test would be passing, right? So again, I want to be as strict as possible in my tests, even if the code might not be, or the language might not be. So let's call, on empty collection, let's call size. And let's go ahead and run this just for giggles. Great, everything's passing. All right, cool. So let's do the same thing here. Let's take this one collection, and let's call size on it, and I'm going to adjust this. Well, let's not copy paste that. Let's do this a little slower for everyone. So let's assert same, and the expected value on one collection, I would expect its size to be 1, and then its actual value is going to just be whatever it's returned, right? So size. And let's see if that works. Great. Sometimes when these tests are all passing, everything's green, everything feels happy, sometimes I'll just go in and kind of switch up the world, make sure things break where I expect them to. So if you're just like headshotting a bunch of these tests out, and they're just passing, right away, I would, go in and fluctuate your input and make sure, one thing at a time, just vary it, make sure that it does fail. You're not just like blindly getting a bunch of passing tests and then later you find out they didn't carry with them any value, right? Okay, another thing I want to point out on test size before we move on to additional items here is that, yes, for isEmpty it was fine to kind of test a empty collection and then a not empty collection. It's a very binary type of thing, right? But size is interesting, and it brings up another interesting point about testing in general. When you do test, or when you're writing tests, you definitely want to think about boundary cases. And really common boundary cases, just in general, right, they may be different for very specific sets of code. But in general, you want to test basically 0, 1, and then many, right? So we have our 0 and 1, and then we want to test many. And many is not 2, right? So that's not 2. We want to test, 3, 4, 5, however many in our system, is representative of kind of a mini set, right? So again, we have 0 and empty, we have 1, but let's go ahead and make another collection that represents many. So in this case, I'm just going to say 3 is fine, right? It's not 0, it's not 1, it's not right at the edge on 2, it's kind of going past that. I would feel pretty comfortable that 3, 4, 5 things in a collection, if that's all passing correctly, like that gives me enough confidence that my system is working correctly. So let's do that. Let's make what I'm going to call a mini collection, a new collection, and I'm just going to throw some items in there. So let's add, I did it again. Let's add 1, and let's do this again, and we'll add 2, and then finally we'll add something like 3.0. Just being a little silly there with the different data types, but that might come in handy here in a minute. And so now we've done our setup. Let's make that assertion assert same. And in this case, I would expect the mini collection to have a size of 3. So there's the expected, and then the actual is going to be the result of calling size. And let's run this. Whoops. Good. Everything's green. 2 tests, 5 assertions. And again, if I'm, feeling a little like, oh, that shouldn't have passed. Well, okay, cool. Failed asserting that 2 is identical to 3. That makes sense, right? Because I only put 2 things in it. So let's go back. Make sure everything's green again. Good. So we're green. All right, so we've got about half of that tested now. Let's do something else here. Let's switch gears a little bit. Another nice thing in testing is, or another thing that I like about testing is testing gives me confidence to refactor my code. There's a lot of arguments. For example, Michael Feathers in Testing Legacy Code, he kind of makes the assertion that if you don't have tests, then everything's legacy code, right? So anything can be legacy code if there are no tests. There's also some assertions out there, some beliefs that you can't truly factor without tests. So this all kind of ties into these clean code workshops that I've been doing, and why I wanted to switch gears to testing is because, yeah, we can change around the code all the time, but as people have probably seen in some of my tweets, I still have some bugs in that code, whether they're syntactical bugs or even actually logical bugs where I condensed the code, but it didn't actually end up doing the same thing. So there's all sorts of reasons why tests are very, very powerful things, but to the point of refactoring that I want to make right now, I want to take the opportunity to also refactor my tests, right? This collection over here is pretty straightforward. It's been refined through some workshops and so forth. There's probably not much refactoring that I'm going to care to do today. But what I want to focus on is that you can also refactor your tests. Your tests are code just like anything else. And I want to vary things one at a time. I don't want to be writing a test for part of my collection class and also refactoring my test collection. So to say that another way, I want to make sure that I'm in like a passing green state before I start fluctuating things. And I only want to fluctuate one thing at a time. So in this case, I'm going to focus on only changing the collection test on this side and refactoring some bits here. And what I want to do is introduce this setup method in PHPUnit. So think of this kind of like the constructor, if you will, but what it does is this is run before your test cases are run. So any kind of setup you want to do for your tests, you can do that here, hence the name, setup. And what I want to do here is I'm noticing that in each one of these test cases, I'm creating a collection, an empty collection, a one collection, a mini collection. I want to go ahead and set those up just once in the test. So I'm going to change these to be properties on the class. And so let's just set those out real quick. So I'm going to make a private empty collection, and I'm just going to duplicate that a little bit and make this one and mini collection. So I'm just doing a little refactoring here to emphasize not only the use of the setup, but also kind of bringing that into the fold of also demonstrating the refactoring that needs to take place sometimes in your tests, and to do that in isolation. So let's set up the empty collection. Let's bring to life this one collection as well, and we'll chop that. All right, and then let's bring the mini collection up here as well. And let's highlight all those. Whoops, not that way. I hate when it kicks back in PHP Storm, like if you don't get that perfectly right, it'll actually, that first will be like a double selection. It's really annoying. Okay, so we got that set up. It makes these a lot tighter. As you can see, we don't have all that setup that's happening. But we do have some more things to clean up here. So let's make that this. And let's change this to this. And make sure to get these other ones. And we don't need this setup anymore down here. As you can see, it's PHP Storm is helping us out by saying, or graying out those variables. Cool. Okay, so here we've refactored everything. We've tightened up our tests significantly. They're all just assertions now, which again, some people kind of aim for that. They're nice and tight. I like that. All of our setup is done in this setup method. That's something that PHPUnit is going to run before our tests, right? So we're leveraging this new method that we just learned to set up the tests. So again, only change the test case. Let's make sure everything's still good in the world. And it is. Awesome. Okay, so let's get back to testing. We're back to add now. Add's a little bit interesting because add we've kind of been using all along. So we've kind of demonstrated that add, seems to work, right? But we could, add something, make sure it's in there, make sure it's not. So let's demonstrate that by doing test add. Let me do a time check here. All right, good. Okay, so even though we just did all that work to change all the setups, add's a little interesting. I don't necessarily want to see that, nothing is in the empty collection, or I added one to the one collection because I've already done it. We want to think about the kind of the behavior of add. So when we go from adding something to not adding something, how does the collection behave, right? And so, for example, we could start with a new collection, and we'll just assert that this thing is empty right away, right? So we can say something like this: assert true on the collection being empty. Now this is really testing is empty, but what we want to do again is kind of do that setup, right? And setups can also include assertions. It doesn't have to be so cut and dry, right? We can actually, confirm behavior before we move forward. So just as a sanity check here, hey, I just want to make sure, even though I'm testing add, I want to make sure that I made this new collection and it's empty. Although this is tested up here, nothing's wrong with a little double coverage, a little sanity check that as you're going through add, the setup for it is correct, right? Because if maybe I set up this collection wrong for some reason, that's going to affect the downstream assertions. So again, I want to make sure that this is just kind of making sure that that truly is empty, nothing else is in it. That way when I go and add something, so let's just add something. Something. Let's put that H back in there. There we go. And then now we can do a couple different assertions on it, right? So let's assert false, right? We would expect it to no longer be empty. So again, we're just kind of testing a lot of its behavior. We could also jump ahead and kind of test contains. We could just give it the full gamut here. Oops, let's make an assertion, right? So this assert true that the collection contains something, the value of something, right? And we could even really go super strict, right? We just keep hammering it away here with even more assertions. We can also just go so far as to say, hey, look, it should really only have one thing in it, right? So I would expect 1 to be the same on its size. Let me clean that up. Sorry about that. So again, I'm going to assert same that I expect its size to be 1. So we've pretty much tested everything here, like every possible state of this collection to really lock add in. And this was kind of the point that I was making earlier. Methods that don't return anything, it can be difficult or challenging to test them directly, right? It can be difficult to test them in isolation. This doesn't return anything, it returns null. There's really no other side effects without testing its state through other methods. And that's something that's going to happen sometimes in your code. It might be difficult to test in isolation, so you need to kind of switch gears and test behavior a little bit more. So in this case, the behavior being that, look, I have a collection that starts out empty, I add something in it, and then there's multiple things that I can check for, such as it's no longer empty, it has the thing that I wanted to add to it in it, and it has a size that reflects the number of things that I've added. So let's make sure that everything's good, and we're green. Awesome. So this should give you a pretty good idea of how we want to test remove, right? In this case, let's not copy and paste. Let's keep building that muscle memory. So let's test remove. And we're pretty much going to do the opposite of what we did in add, right? We would want to have a collection. It's pretty straightforward. Let's go ahead and add something to it. And I will copy and paste just these lines individually. At this point, we're going to go backwards here. And let's say, hey, okay. And then I want to now remove something. We'll write this out the long way. So let's remove something. And then I'm going to assert that it is now an empty collection. And we could go so far as to say, oh, contains returns false and so forth. But I think this, to me, is, again, confident enough. These assertions are all about confidence. Like, if this full way makes you confident, in my opinion, there's nothing wrong with writing some of these additional ones. You may only really care about that one, but I don't think it hurts to do the rest. And again, in this case, since it's just an empty collection, it doesn't bother me to just do the one assertion there. So let's make sure everything's good, and it is. Now with that said, I do want to point out that remove and add definitely have a lot of bits that we haven't tested, right? And we're going to see these in future workshops, especially when we practice something like TDD. But for example, remove, this test would pass if I simply just emptied out the entire array, right? So if we think about the underlying of collection, if I ever call remove, all I've really tested for is that I have one thing in it and then I'm empty afterwards, if we kind of think about that. So this goes back to those cases where I've really only tested the one collection. I haven't tested removing something from an empty collection. I haven't tested removing something that has multiple items in the collection. I'll leave that to you all as homework, but I do want to point out that this is one of those areas where when you're coming back and testing legacy code, you may not have those different kind of flows in your mind, right? You may not have some of those edge cases. You might just test for like this, what I call, or what people call, the happy path. In this case, hey, I have something and I remove it, but I didn't really test, well, what if I remove the wrong thing? What if I remove 99 things? Now that's not to say you need to write this super exhaustive remove test to remove everything, from this super large array of all different data types. But it is one of those scenarios where, again, the empty, the one, and the many, you might want to make sure at least those are covered, or at least think them through. But we'll leave that as an exercise, either for the questions or on Twitter. So let's test contains, and this will be our last one. So here we can go back to using the empty set. So let's do something like this, assert false, and let's just say, hey, the empty collection, let's see if this contains anything. Doesn't really matter, right? So that should be false. It shouldn't contain that. Let's go ahead and say assert false, let's assert true in this case, that the one collection, Looks like I'm lagging here a little bit. Hopefully it's okay on the video. Okay, so this one collection contains, what did we put in one? We put in one. And we could also do kind of a negative assertion here. We could say something like the one collection contains, you know, something else. Again, just enough to kind of feel good that contains doing the right thing. And we'll do the same thing for the mini collection. Let's go ahead and finish that out. This assert true. This, the mini collection, contains, and I think we put in 1 here. And then we also have 2. Let's get a little tricky here. Let's say that we know from like a business decision or from a logic perspective that we don't really care containment as far as type goes. So we could actually, instead of making this the integer 2, as we set it up here, we could make this 2. And then down here we could do something like, 3 to ensure that those are the same. And then just for sanity, we'll do one of those kind of negative checks. So we'll do something like false on 1. And we pass. So again, we kind of headshotted those. Let's do something just to kind of mess this up a little bit. So let's do something like 2. That actually might be type juggling. So yeah, PHP in general as a language is kind of messing us up there with the type juggling. So all the more reason I like to make sure that things are strict. We haven't implemented that over here. That's for another day. But point being is that that actually passed even though we didn't want it to. So let's just change this to 1. Cool. So I'm seeing some failures here. I feel okay that those are all right. And plus, I've written that several times. So we know that that's good. So let's recap real quick, and then I'll jump back into Slack for some questions. So in this case, what we've done is we've created a test. We've actually given it, just like any other class, we've given it properties and so forth that we could use. Instead of a constructor, though, we have this setup method, and this is what's actually called before your test cases are run. So in here, we've basically hydrated these properties. So we've made a new collection that's empty for the empty collection. We've done a new collection and added 1 item to it for our 1 collection. And then a mini collection, we added a couple different items to it. And we got a little fancy with types here too, just to demonstrate that our current collection class does not care strictly about the types of items that are within it. At that point, we pretty much proceeded down the line of testing some what I'm calling legacy code, meaning code without tests. So in this case, I just started at the top, is empty, and I tried to think through the different flows. So is empty on an empty collection? True. Is empty on a 1 collection? That should be false. Did the same thing with size, and we just, again, went down the line. Add was a little interesting, a little different than these. It wasn't just assertion. It required a little more setup, and it also required some, what I'm calling kind of behavioral checking, right? Instead of being able to check the input and output of add directly, we kind of had to check the state of a collection after calling something like add. And this is because add has no direct way to kind of test it in isolation, right? We can't test it without using some of the other pieces, or in this case, messing with these properties directly, right? And it would be better in the world if these were private. In fact, I thought they were, but I treated them as such, but let's make that explicit. So those are private. So I can't just reach in and look at count, right? I don't have this intimate knowledge of that collection. I actually have to use the other methods like isEmpty and contains and size to make sure that add behaved the way that I would expect it to. We did the same thing with remove because, again, it's not returning anything particular. But contains, we were able to go back to kind of our straightforward approach of just making a bunch of isolated assertions and testing some input and being able to vary the output accordingly. And that, again, by definition, is unit testing. Isolating a very particular piece of code that's not necessarily collaborating with other sets of code, so we can test it in isolation, really black box input-output. So we see that pretty well in contain, size, and empty, but we see that we kind of run in, there's a boundary to being able to test in isolation or to strictly unit tests. Even though we are writing PHP unit tests, we did test these in more of a behavioral way. And we'll talk more about that in the future. But what I want to do now is, first of all, let's make sure everything still passes, just so we can end on a nice green note. Great, looks good. And what I'm going to do is fire up Slack again to make sure that we have a good few minutes for, yeah, we got a good 13 minutes here for questions. So let me let this beast of an application fire back up. All right. And yeah, I think people were noting that there was a little bit of lag earlier, so if these questions are coming across a little slow, or hopefully if Slack even starts up, we'll see. I may, let's give this just another second. I may kill the stream if this isn't coming across. Do I still have an internet connection? Now I'm getting a little recording. It's thinking about it. It's just super slow. All right, I'm gonna jump over to questions. Don't see anything in questions, which makes me nervous that did my stream die? Feeling lonely here. Where is my stream? Let's go. Creator. 1 second, I'm just making sure this stream is still working okay. It says I'm live now. Don't have many watchers. I am getting some questions coming in. Are you guys still seeing the live stream? Or did it die? Because my OBS is like not responding. Anybody in Slack? I'm gonna take that as a no. Oh, I'm good. Okay. Sorry, felt like super lonely there for a second. Okay, so good. I'll start answering questions, assuming that's all still working. I don't know why my OBS is frozen on this side, but yeah, cool. Thanks, guys. Thanks for the feedback. Okay, so is there any functions like opposite to setup, like over? Oh, like it's like an end. So yeah, so I think there is like a teardown kind of method, and to that point, let's actually bring up the PHPUnit documentation. So yeah, let me blow this up just for a second. But yeah, you're right. This documentation is actually pretty good. It's pretty dense too, but everything you ever need is going to be here. So real quick, just first before I finish answering that question, in their Appendix A, there are all these different assertions. So like I said, there are a whole lot of them inside of here. So assert null, false, file, count, directories, all sorts of things, instance of, array, has key, all sorts of assertions. So I would definitely recommend, just kind of as a side from the question, to jump in here and just kind of go to this assertions section and really honestly just scroll through them. Just you might not use them all right away, but at least kind of just familiarize yourself that they exist. So going back to the question though, so is there the opposite of setup? Yes. Setup is, I'm trying to find the name of it because I don't use it too often, but I think I want to call it teardown. Let's just do a Google search instead of me fumbling around. So PHPUnit teardown. And it is called teardown indeed. Okay, cool. Yeah, so yes, here's your answer. There is setup that is run against, and then once the test methods are finished, it will run teardown. So I think I saw another question in there, but basically before a test case or a test method is run every time, so every test case it's going to run setup, and then there's also teardown, which is the opposite. So that should answer that question. JMac, what do you think about the current trend among Laravel devs against unit testing in favor of all integration E2E testing? Yeah, I think that's interesting. I definitely think it works for the framework. And what I mean by that is I think Laravel has done an excellent job of making sure that some of the common pain points that people kind of complain about integration or end-to-end testing E2E is that it's slow, for example, right? Like it's super slow to run those kind of tests, or it's really hard to like set up a sandbox environment for Stripe or PayPal or whatever. So anyways, Laravel, I think, again, has done a good job to make that like super fast and make that really painless. And because that pain's gone, I think there is this trend of kind of writing them there. It's also super easy to write integration tests, I think, because you're writing them more in a way like login, right? Like it's pretty easy to write an integration test for login. Like at a high level, you really know what login is supposed to do. I think after the fact, kind of like I was talking about today, it can be really difficult to write unit tests because coming up with all those boundary cases can be hard. Definitely hard after the fact. Maybe when you're doing like TDD, it's easier to kind of see those. But again, you don't know what you don't know. So I still tend to stick in unit tests, but it's because I don't use Laravel for every single project. I think if I was solely using Laravel, I'd probably fall into the integration E2E kind of tests more heavy than the unit tests. But in the end, test or test to me, I don't care which one you write. All right, let's see here. We got another one. Do you do TDD or do you write the code and test after? Both. I try to do TDD where it's brand new code, but there is definitely code I have in projects that's not tested. So I'll do more of an approach like today. So I'll give just another, let's say, 2 minutes for questions. Otherwise, I'm going to go ahead and shut it down. So it looks like the live stream, only 20 watching. Geez, there's so many more people in Slack. I guess that's why I was worried that it wasn't coming across. Did somebody post something in workshops here? Still live? Okay, good, thanks. Okay. I think we're good, so I am going to go back over to YouTube here and just stop this, and then of course that video will be freely available to anybody once they finish processing it. I see somebody typing here, Omar. Looks like Omar is typing, so I'll give you the last question, Omar, if it's truly a question. Uh-oh, now Lee is in there. I know you probably already talked about this, but what is the importance of testing from your opinion? Oh, that's a good point. I probably didn't talk about that enough in the beginning. I definitely like testing because it gives me confidence. I didn't used to test. Definitely about 3 years ago, I really honestly probably never tested. That doesn't mean I didn't like manually test my code when I got done with it, like fired up the browser and made sure like the form that I built worked. But it was really, again, just like human testing. It was me kind of validating my work, and really not everyone does that. Trust me. I've worked on many teams, and not all devs even do that. And I think it's after a few products that maybe you make, or a few big projects that you have that have larger scale, and even clients coming back and kind of complaining. I think we all know that there's value, right? But I didn't really truly see it until I started working on a TDD team, an extreme programming team that practiced pair programming. We practiced TDD. We practiced like lean methodologies, and all these things like really leveled up not only my coding skills but my testing skills, and the confidence to know that I can go in and like change any bit of my code and not really have to worry because I have this, test suite that really drove it all out. I mean, we saw that earlier when I was even changing the test case, for example. I was able to just go in real quick, copy paste, make properties, change things, turn things into local variables, and kind of cut a lot of code out, and do that really quickly and therefore really confidently, and being able to trust that I didn't introduce a bug or didn't break my code in some obscure way. And so that's why testing's important to me, anyways, kind of on a personal opinion. All right, last question. When testing the remove option, since we are testing the add method before, do we need to assert adding before? Yes, okay, I see this outline that you got here. Okay, so I think what you're asking is, do we really need to kind of retest add? No, you don't have to. This section of code here is really just like a sanity check. And that's what I was saying earlier about the same type of code here. Like this is a sanity check. This is just making sure that like my test setup is correct. This has nothing to do with testing the actual behavior of the class. Actually, the sanity check ends here. In this case, it's a lot shorter. So in this case, here's my sanity check, right? Starts here and ends here. And all that's doing, again, is just making sure that like I don't have any kind of weird test pollution. Maybe if I was using the one collection and I truly added something to it and it became obviously a two collection. So again, it's really just here. It's a habit of mine. It's not a requirement, to your point. It's just there truly for that. It's just to make sure that I've set up the test correctly before I start testing on this thing I actually care about. And again, I do that not just for sanity because this is a behavioral type of test. I'm not able to test a return value or something directly that would give me that same level of confidence. So I've just made a few extra assertions to kind of bring that confidence level back up to a comfortable point where it's like, okay, look, I made a collection, I knew it was empty, then I added something to it and made sure that its state was correct, or as expected in this case. So. Cool. All right, I'm going to shut down the stream, but I will hang out in Slack for the day if anybody has more questions, and I'll probably do a follow-up blog post on this in the next week or so. But the next time what we're going to do is cover mockery. So obviously this was a very simple set of code with input-output, a class with no collaboration or dependencies. So next time we will introduce some more complications by introducing code that collaborates with other objects, as well as introducing mockery. So thank you all for